have a little lunch break at work. So I just wanted to share something that I've been working on with you. And if you're familiar with our page, basically I just try to post a little bit of brain information every day. Sometimes the content's a little better on some days and other days, just depending on my time. But I really appreciate everyone that follows our page. And if you're a practitioner, we've also created some courses that teach some of the stuff that my colleagues and I do in the clinic. And it's really just based around neuroplasticity. So I'm a chiropractor by trade. I'm also a nurse practitioner, but I really fell in love with working with the brain just because I had no idea how it really worked. So the more I learned, the more I was interested, and the more I realized that some of the stuff that I learned in school could really help people. So if you have suffered from a brain injury, or if you have a loved one who suffered from a brain injury, I wanted to create this course for both the practitioner or for people that just want to learn more. And this is just a little intro to it. I'm continuing to work on it the next couple of weeks. So this is brain injury basics. Some of the objectives, and I'm going to expand on this. I will talk today about the first one. So some of the cellular mechanisms of brain injury, because this is the most interesting to me, mostly because it's the most confusing to me. And then I'm going to talk about neuroanatomy, talk about the different lobes of the brain. And part of the Brain Rehab's Basics course that I created last year talks about therapies for lobes of the brain. So if you're interested, check that out. That's a pretty cool little class I put together. Then I'm going to talk about primitive reflexes in brain injury. And if you're familiar with primitive reflexes and you work with patients that have retained primitive reflexes, it's really interesting because in brain injury, when things go offline in the brain, these primitive reflexes start to resurface. So what was once not there starts to resurface, and it can cause some delays in neurological progression. And then I'll talk about hormonal disruption in brain injury and probably go a little bit deeper into neurotransmitter changes and things of that nature. But first thing I wanted to talk about was what our brain really needs to not only survive, but to be able to thrive and to be able to be well in its environment, to create positive plastic changes in the brain. You really need three things. You need oxygen, glucose, and stimulation. And that makes sense, right? Like, can't do much without oxygen. We can't do too much without fuel. I'm sure we all have the friend or loved one who gets hangry if they haven't, or if they've missed a meal. But then what we really need is stimulation. And stimulation comes in the sense of different types of therapies and modalities, chiropractic care, physical therapy, massage therapy, anything to stimulate the brain. Because have you seen before, I've mentioned on the page, our brain's just a big sensory sponge, and it really relies on external cues and external information to be able to build and to be able to create positive plasticity. So the question is what happens in a brain injury to these three things? And I'm only going to base this off of one research paper that's 20 years old, which I know sounds a little bit outdated and crazy, but it's such a good paper. And they also, the authors, I think they liked it so much and got a good response that 13 years later, they wrote another paper on it. So what happens in the brain after injury is there's been research that shows that you can lose up to 50% of cerebral blood flow. So, and this is based on concussion. And severe traumatic brain injury can be as high as 85%. That's a problem because if you don't have oxygen to the cells can die. So that's something to think about. That's really important when we look at therapy for brain injury. The other thing that happens if we look at glucose, just kind of like an over the big surface view of glucose, our brain kind of goes into crisis mode, and it requires a lot of energy to try to recalculate and recalibrate what's been lost. And that puts our brain and the cells in our brain into a state of what's called hyperglycolysis. So there's a hypermetabolic state that our brain goes into after a brain injury, which can cause a lot of issues. One issue in particular is that due to the loss of oxygen after a brain injury or the loss of cerebral blood flow, then we don't have the right fuel to be able to provide the glucose to the cells that need it. So that's an issue. With hyperglycolysis, you also can get increased lactate production. And then also there can be so much energy demand with the ATP pumps, because as you'll see in a second, you get these ion fluctuations So you just can't fuel the ATP pumps. No oxygen, no glucose. You can't really fuel those ATP pumps. So the glucose gets disrupted, oxygen gets disrupted. And then with stimulation, it's just really hard to build plasticity in a brain that's not getting good oxygen and a brain that's not getting good glucose, because our neurons need the appropriate chemical environment to create a positive plastic environment. So stimulation kind of goes to the wayside. And, the whole sit in a dark room, relax and rest until you feel better, that whole model is kind of drifting away. And what really needs to happen is there should be some rest that's put in place, and we have to let the inflammation do its job. But after that, we got to get to it. We got to try to make positive changes to the brain because, like we said, the brain relies on stimulation. Okay, so why is this important? This is important to me because I've had some concussions and I didn't know what the heck was going on. And it's really important too because I see a lot of concussion patients. And as a lot of you know very well, it's considered a silent epidemic because you'll get a brain scan such as a CT or an MRI, it comes back normal, and therefore there's no further treatment that's necessary because you're normal. But the truth is that if you're not looking at the macroscopic level, like the brain tissue or the tracts of the brain, then what really needs to happen is we need to look at the microscopic level. And that's why this paper is so important, because you've got to see what's happening at the cellular level. You've got to see what's causing axonal dysfunction, what's causing neuronal dysfunction. Why isn't the brain able to do its job the way that it was doing before? And to me, personally, I think it boils down to what's happening at the cellular level. So there's functional microscopic injuries, and this can be due to something as simple as ionic shifts, metabolic changes, and impaired neurotransmission. So this is the paper I was talking about in the Journal of Athletic Training. You've probably seen me post it before. The paper is called The Neurometabolic Cascade of Concussion. The more I read about, when I research looking for neurotransmitter changes in brain injury, this is one of the first papers that pops up. When I'm looking at cellular changes in brain injury, this is one of the first papers that pops up. So I just kind of kept coming back to this paper, and the one diagram in particular I kept looking at was this one here. And it's kind of hard to see because it's black and white. It's not in color. My brain's always attracted to colorful pictures and illustrations. So what I needed to do was I needed to break this down, because when I look at it, I'm like, oh crap, like what does this mean exactly? So I wanted to break it down for you guys. And that's all I'm going to talk about today is the cellular changes and how this kind of breaks down. So what you'll see, number one, you have an action potential, right? But immediately after biomechanical injury to the brain, there's indiscriminate and abrupt release of neurotransmitters and unchecked ionic fluxes that occur. What does that mean exactly? Well, if you remember from middle school and high school, you have your sodium potassium pump. And the goal of the sodium potassium pump is to pump potassium into the cell and pump sodium out of the cell. And there needs to be a good, healthy balance of that. But what happens after a brain injury is that there's a binding of excitatory neurotransmitters, something such as glutamate and others, but just glutamate to name one of them. And the glutamate will bind to what's called an NMDA receptor. And if you think of an NMDA receptor, just kind of think of like a door to a house, right? With every, okay, let's say this, it's a door to a bar, and you can only get into the bar if you're a certain age. So outside of that NMDA receptor, there's a bouncer. And with NMDA receptors, that bouncer is actually magnesium. So you kind of have what's called like a magnesium plug that sits in front of the NMDA receptor, and it allows things to go in and out of the cell. That's disrupted in a brain injury, but also there's neuronal depolarization, which causes changes in the sodium potassium pump. So you get this sudden efflux or outflow of potassium from the cell, and then sodium can start to drift into the cell, along with other things such as calcium. So fourth on this image, increased membrane pumping. So when there's an increased outflux or efflux of potassium, then the sodium potassium pump goes, oh crap, things aren't working the way that they should. We need to restore homeostasis. We need to balance this cell back to the way it was. And the way it does that is by engaging the sodium potassium pump. The problem with the sodium potassium pump is it's very active and energy demanding. Some of these ions can flow in and out of the cell freely, but some require energy to do that. And this is one of those. So if you can imagine, if there's insult to the cellular tissue from a biomechanical force, such as a concussion, it's going to change the sodium potassium pump. Energy levels are going to go crazy. And then we have this issue where you have an energy demanding pump trying to help out, but it just doesn't have the energy to do that. Then we get to what's called a hyperglycolysis state. So the sodium potassium pump, like I said, requires a lot of ATP. And when the cells beat up, it's not down with the ATP. So it triggers a dramatic jump in glucose metabolism, which is what I mentioned earlier. This hypermetabolic state occurs in the setting of diminished cerebral blood flow. So there's no fuel to push the fuel to where the fuel needs to go. And this can create what's called a cellular energy crisis. In the paper, in the literature, it describes it as a spreading depression of the cellular tissue. So it's not a good thing. And, it's basically, if you just think about crisis mode, everything's kind of in crisis mode. The accelerated glycolysis leads to increased lactate production. And, if you're familiar with lactosis or lactic acid production, you can imagine, like, if you go on a treadmill or go for a run for a long period of time, the muscles start to get fatigued and tired. And you get this outflux or outflow of lactic acid into the muscle tissue, and that creates a lot of energy reduction in those muscles. Same thing happens with the cell. But in this case, the elevated lactate levels, it can result in what's called neuronal dysfunction because you've lost that normal balance. It can lead to what's called acidosis. It can cause membrane damage. It can alter permeability of the blood-brain barrier. So this is a big one because, as I've mentioned in other talks, the blood-brain barrier is like a screen door to the brain. The brain is a very sterile environment, and it only allows certain things in. So just like if you're sitting on your back patio on a nice summer day, you're trying to enjoy the breeze, then all of a sudden there's a small tear in your screen porch. Now these mosquitoes can start to kind of get in and cause disruption to your nice relaxing afternoon. The same thing can happen in the brain. Basically, the blood-brain barrier will open up and these creepy crawlers will start to get into the brain through that barrier because it's broken down. And that can happen from the increased lactic acid production. This is kind of a lot of information on this page. Hang with me. Almost done. The persistent increases. Okay, so sorry. Number 7, calcium sequestration and mitochondrial dysfunction occurs. So we all know mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. And if we have mitochondrial dysfunction due to changes in calcium levels, then we're not going to be able to have energy to be able to make the cell work the way it should. So persistent increases in calcium can impair mitochondrial oxidative metabolism and worsen this crisis that's happening within the cell. The unchecked calcium accumulation, it can also directly activate pathways that lead to cellular death. So we're basically just getting continued energy crisis. Further down the road towards cellular death, we have decreased energy production. Without energy, the cell can't do its job, and then that leads to possible cell death. So the other thing that's notable to mention, and this is just, again, kind of a broad. But magnesium. So magnesium, like I said, it's important with magnesium because magnesium serves as almost like a plug or a bouncer to the cell, right? The NMDA receptor is the door in to the bar or the cell, and the magnesium is the bouncer. When you have this increased excitation and you have these excitatory neurotransmitters that are released, such as glutamate, they can go by and just say, hey, get out of the way, magnesium, and they can work their way into the cell. So with a magnesium deficiency, which can occur after a TBI, you can also have opening of these receptors. Bad things can get into the cell, excitatory neurotransmitters, and cause an energy crisis, which leads to cellular death. Why is this important at the cellular level? Well, it's important because if your cell environment isn't healthy, it's going to be very difficult to create a healthy brain environment. Without a healthy brain environment, you can't produce positive plasticity. So people will complain of brain fog. They'll be fatigued all the time. This can create things like headaches. And then this can also, change neurotransmitter function, which can lead to personality changes, motivational changes, and things of that nature. So I hope I didn't screw up this talk too much. But yeah, decreased magnesium levels may lead to neuronal dysfunction, if y'all can hear me. But I hope this kind of makes sense. And the purpose of I know this isn't really basic stuff, but I think if we can just look at it and say, hey, what's the big picture here? The big picture here is cell health can totally suck and it can get beat up pretty bad. And what we need to start looking at is we need to look at ways to support the cell before we start doing anything. We need to kind of dampen the inflammation after inflammation does its job of cleaning out the bad stuff. But if we have this persistent inflammatory response in the brain, it's going to be hard to make positive changes to the brain. One other thing I didn't mention is throughout this whole process, whenever you have these extracellular changes, the microglial cells get activated, and their job is to go in and clean up the debris. And with persistent microglial activation, you can get consistent and persistent inflammatory responses. So these microglial cells, which are kind of like the cleanup crew, they'll start to keep working, and then they do their job so well that they start to possibly maybe even attack normal tissue, which can lead to what's called neuroautoimmunity. So now they get so confused because they've been so busy and they're kind of beat up and tired. They start to actually attack things that they shouldn't attack. So it's important to look at this from a cellular level and to check this stuff out. And I'm really excited about this brain injury basics course. I'll do a couple more free talks, but if you're really interested in learning more about the cellular science, the lobe science, the neuroanatomy of a brain injury, and then how to heal it from the nutritional side and then also from the neuro rehab side, I think this course will be a good fit for you. So I'll keep you guys posted as soon as I can get it wrapped up. But I hope everybody's staying safe. And I really appreciate your time. And again, I really appreciate everybody that follows our page. And we'll talk to you guys soon. Have a great day.